Chapter 3. Preparations for Battle. Geradius stood up from his chair, cleared his throat, and said,
"All right, let's begin with our meeting."
He shifted about a little uncomfortably. The curiosity with which those around the table were regarding him was intensifying, like fresh flames in a forest fire.
Now I suppose you're wondering why I have called upon you all this?
You're bloody darn tootin' right,
Shouted Alfred.
Dragged us from our work and our homes, you did.
Added Lefroy.
Enough!
Shouted Geradius, drawing in a deep breath and then eyeing those around the table as if daring them to try and challenge him. Nobody spoke.
The reason
Geradius continued, speaking now rather loudly.
is that we have sighted the British.
A symphony of reactions resounded across the meeting table, some of amazement, some fear, others of excitement, and a few of indignation.
The men before us have recently come across a small British settlement just across the mountains.
At last we have found the British.
Lefroy interrupted, though he received no more acknowledgement than a slight nod from Geradius, who continued.
They believe we can capture this settlement.
Chatter erupted once more around the table at these words, forcing Geradius to speak at the top of his voice.
There is more news.
Within an instant, all conversation stopped, and everyone turned to look at Geradius with mixed expressions of excitement and fear.
The scouts discovered something more, something else in their journey. Not far from Port Jackson, they have come across a British battleship. Not many are aboard this ship. It sounds as though it's waiting upon its crew. This is our time to strike.
As the night went on, Geradius went into detail about the elaborate plans that he had developed, explaining how the armies would be prepared, who would march in the assault, and every fine detail of their planned assault. There were a myriad of details that needed to be discussed, and it was not until the candles had burned down low that they had finished reading through the scrolls of parchment scattered across the table. 2 assault parties were being formed, one for each of the planned attacks, and there was much debate about how to divide the weapons that were in their control.
Geradius, for what reason should David need to take one of our 2 cannons?
Solomon asked in a deep, commanding voice.
Why does he need it if he's planning to capture the British ship and not destroy it?
It is a diversion. Trust me in that he will be needing the cannon. You can take it up with David if you have any issues.
Geradius, are you sure you are the one who should be leading this fight?
Said Alfred, standing up in his chair so that he came up to height with Morrissey and Bronwyn at his either side.
You're younger than many at this table.
Do not judge me by my age. If it had not been for my leadership, where would we be right now? I led us from Port Jackson, and I can lead us now.
Alfred seemed as though he wanted to press the matter further, but instead he slowly shrank back to his seat until his head was barely visible from above the table. Morrissey looked up from underneath his hooded cape and spoke softly.
We have talked at great lengths, but I am still not sure of where this settlement and ship are found.
This was a question that Geradius could not field. He turned and looked questioningly at the men behind him, till one of the scouts volunteered and stood forward.
Do we have a map?
Just at the table here.
As the night went on, the details that had before been unclear began to crystallize for each member of the council. They continued to talk and talk at great lengths until the candles had run out of life, and, when they bade their farewells, they did so, knowing that the next time they gathered for another meeting, much would have changed. When Geradius laid his weary head on his bed, he found that sleep did not come. His mind was buzzing with everything that had happened today. When he finally did drift off, his sleep was fragmented and restless all night. On the following morning, the clearing was buzzing with life. It seemed that word travelled faster than the wind, as every man, woman, and child knew that the British had been sighted. Geradius thought that the chatter and excitement was unparalleled to any other day since they had first settled in the clearing. It was not shared by all, however. Some wore expressions of a solemn and sullen nature. That morning, when Geradius rose from bed, he went straight into the meeting room. In there he found his rifle and sword, lying in the corner of the room where he had last left them. Bringing them with him from their place of resting, he looked closely at the sword. The hilt was black and encrusted with silver grooves that melded perfectly with his fingers. It had been a gift from his father. He sheathed the sword and slung the rifle around his back before heading out to the clearing to oversee the preparations. That night, when he slumped back into his bed, Geradius found that sleep eluded him even more than the previous night. Time was hurtling forwards, and before he knew it, he would be marching to battle. The thought of the path that lay before them made him nervous, to say the least. This battle would test the faith that his people had in his leadership, and in truth, it was already testing his faith in his own leadership. The 2 days that followed passed in a similar blur to the first. Preparations for battle continued, and every person was busy and at edge for the knowledge of what was ahead of them. The 4th day seemed to pass in the blink of an eye, and before Geradius knew it, he and David were lying in their beds on the eve of their march.
Are you still awake?
Geradius whispered. 10 seconds of silence went by, and he was ready to abandon hope when David roused slightly.
Ah,
David moaned quietly.
is it morning already?
No, not morning yet.
Sleep then. We'll be needing rest for the march.
Geradius could not sleep. He was happy that David was still awake, as he had not had a chance to speak with him at full length since the night of their last council meeting. He chose his following words very carefully.
Are you nervous?
Am I nervous?
David considered this for a moment.
I am, and then I am not.
He said.
What do you mean by that?
That I have moments, yes, where it does get the better of me. They pass.
You speak almost as if this is a common topic.
Just rest well, Geradius. We will need our strength for the march and the battle.
Geradius wanted to push the conversation further, to admit to the emotions that were beginning to flood his mind. But he knew he could not push the matter any further, and he continued to stare at the roof, and he listened as David began to draw in louder and fuller breaths. Geradius's eyes flung wide open. He saw that he was the only one in the room and was stricken with panic. He must have overslept. Rushing about like a madman, he scoffed some nearby food down, dressed and shoved his boots on. He grabbed his weapons and, without delay, ran through each door of the house and out into the clearing. It was there that he met a dazzling blaze which blinded him momentarily. Not a cloud was in the sky. As his vision cleared, he saw that the people before him had marshaled into 3 distinct groups, which varied considerably in size. Everyone was facing in his direction, while he finished tying the sheathed sword around his waist and slung the rifle round his back. It made him feel out of place, as though they were expecting him to address them formally in some shape or form. Instead, he moved over to 2 men who stood at the front of the largest of the groups, which was made of more than 300 people.
"Your army awaits you, sire,"
said Hector, in a medieval mocking tone. The scout to his side shifted about a little uncomfortably. Looking out across his people, Geradius saw so many varied expressions, and each of them seemed to mirror the emotions that were running wild in his mind. Each person was armed. Many had makeshift weapons, and some had rope.
So, are we ready to leave?
Geradius asked.
Just awaiting your orders, sir,
said the scout. Geradius looked over to David. He was standing in front of the second assembly of people and had donned clothing that appeared to blend in perfectly with the ground and his surroundings. Everyone in the formation behind him was dressed similarly, as they had smeared clay across their clothes to help with the camouflage. A cannon sat at the rear of the formation of men behind David. Geradius looked back at his army and announced to them in a booming voice,
My men, we march to the British settlement, and we must make haste. We must arrive there as soon as possible.
He then turned to the scout at his side.
You may lead the way.
Yes, sir,
The scout replied. The large assembly began to march to the opposite side of the clearing and into the shadowy trees that lined the boundary. As he slipped into the darkness, Geradius ventured one last look at David, who was returning his gaze with a meaningful expression. Would they ever meet again? Geradius wondered to himself.